Hello, thank you for joining me on my evening walk as I talk to you about Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, I do insist that this is an essential book that everybody should read at some point in their life. It is a great book, despite what some people have said about it, or particularly the most famous person to dismiss the book would be Malcolm X. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But despite all that, I actually think it's a very good book. It's a very important book, and a great character building book in many different ways. So first off, I would say the book needs to be, I would recommend it for high school, mostly. And the reason I'm doing this one, even though this is mostly a playlist for fifth graders in elementary school, is because I do see this book sometimes on the list recommended for junior high kids, junior high age kids. And I will say I did read it in 7th grade, and I did enjoy it, but I was a weird 7th grader. So if you're a weird 7th and 8th grader and you have no problem picking up a 400-page book and tearing right through it with its Victorian language and sometimes long scenes, then go ahead and read it and enjoy it. Otherwise, I would say wait until you're in high school. The other reason I'd say you might want to wait is it is a very intense, and it does show slavery in all of its details, and including sometimes the subject matter of what sometimes happened between slaves and their slave owners. I don't want to go too far, but I'll leave it there. So parents, if you're watching, hopefully you understand what I'm saying. But so that does come into it. So if your kid's not ready for that, and I'd say I can't think of a 5th grader who is ready for that message, then I would say skip it. But if you're in high school or you're an adult, I would recommend it because it is a very good book. It's so into the plot and the premise. The story is about one of the greatest characters ever written, a great example, one of the most virtuous characters I've ever come across, and he's the title character, Uncle Tom, and he starts off in, if I remember right, Kentucky, and eventually the book, he passes through 3 different owners, and each, well, I won't go into that. But so he passes through 3 different owners, and it's pretty heavy-handed. Harriet Beecher Stowe was deliberately trying to say, isn't slavery bad? She was not trying to gloss it over. It was a propaganda piece, and a well-written one, if I may say, despite sometimes being heavy-handed and rather stilty sometimes. But he's a great character. He's a great example of virtue. And I think anybody could read Uncle Tom's Cabin and should come out a better person just from the example of Uncle Tom. And there's a character, rather unrealistic, but great. I shouldn't say unrealistic, but unusual young lady named Evangeline who befriends him. And there's a lot of Christian symbolism and allegory, well, not allegory, definitely not allegory, but allusions. Uncle Tom is clearly a Christ figure who suffers for the benefit of others, and is constantly living out the Christian values. And even, if you can figure this out, if he's a Christ figure, most Christ figures in stories, their story ends the same way as Christ. So that shouldn't be much of a spoiler. You kind of figure that out, that this is where it's going by the end. Excuse me. But reasons why I think everybody should read it is, for one thing, it is a historically significant book. Just for the sake of just seeing, it was the most popular book of the 1850s. multiple editions put out, plays written, even after the Civil War, it was still a popular book, and there were plays of it, musicals, and it's a historically significant book. And yes, I would point to it as one of the reasons why the Civil War came about. The other thing is it is a beautiful book. Now there are some, like I said, it's sometimes a little Victorian and melodramatic, which is why it was turned into a play. It fits just right into those Victorian melodramatic plays with fainting ladies and villains and, virtuous characters who are, almost unrealistically virtuous. But all that being said, there's also some great excitement. There's some great scenes of escape and danger. So some scenes that actually had me, even as a kid, gripping the book with white knuckle grip. I couldn't stop reading. So it's one of the books that I definitely was reading under the covers when I was supposed to be sleeping. As a 7th grader, my mom can't punish me now for that, so it's okay if I admit it. But Uncle Tom's Cabin, beautiful book, beautiful characters, highly recommended. It's one of those ones I would actually say is an essential book that every American should read. So let's see if I can think of anything else I need to say about it. The reading level, it's definitely high school level. So if your kid's not reading at a high school level, they probably don't want to read it. You do have to have some patience because there are some, it takes a while sometimes with some scenes, and it is 400 pages long, but I think it's worth it just for, morally and just historically, and I think you will be entertained. Let's see. Anything else you might want to know about it? It was, interestingly, yes. So one of the critiques that is made of it is that it's an exaggeration of the evils of slavery. And when I read it again as an adult, with having heard all these critiques, I read it again thinking about that and finding, no, actually, when you read Uncle Tom's Cabin and then read, say, the narrative of Frederick Douglass, where Frederick Douglass wrote about his own experience as a slave, what he wrote is actually much worse than Uncle Tom's Cabin. So she actually makes slavery look maybe better than what the reality was. And some people said, well, she'd never been to the South, so how would she know? Well, she had been to the South. She'd been to Kentucky many times, and slavery was right across the river in Kentucky where she lived. And she based her story on actual slave narratives, like Frederick Douglass. So, granted, she wasn't there to necessarily describe everything exactly right, but the substance of the book comes straight out of actual historical, contemporary at the time, documentation and testimony. So it'd be no different from, say, if I were to write a story about ancient Egypt. How am I going to write about it? Well, I'm going to read the testimony, read as much as I can about it, and then try to write a historical fiction novel. Maybe that one's not a great example because we don't know as much about ancient Egypt, but if, any historical period, I might not have been there or know of or lived through it, but I can make up a story that could be historically accurate, and just based on reading what other people who were there said about it. And so I find that's a kind of a lame, even at the time, especially at the time, it was a lame attempt to dismiss the book. And there's an amazing part that I would recommend, or that of course I recommend it, towards the end, where the scene where these men are watching a slave getting whipped and beaten. And this man from the north, he looks at these Southerners, he says, how can you put up with this? How can you allow slavery when this is happening? And they make the argument, well, many of our slaves are well treated. He's one of the exceptions. And so that, you can't judge us all by that guy. And he makes the argument, he says, yeah, but when you defend slavery at all, you're defending this guy. So either you defend slavery and allow this, or you get rid of it, and therefore it's gone. You can't, and so, and he says it better, or she writes it better. So This might be my longest review, 10 minutes. So yes, I'll end it right there. Uncle Tom's Cabin, great book, highly recommend. Everybody should read it. Hope you enjoy.